Hello, you're listening to the True Crime Witch podcast, the podcast that takes you into everything murderous, mysterious, and downright macabre. I'm your host, Emma, and you're listening to episode 20, The Murder of Fanny Adams. Before we jump into the episode, I'd like to make a disclaimer that the True Crime Witch podcast covers topics such as rape, murder, crimes against children, and other sensitive topics, and this podcast won't be for everyone. Your listener discretion is advised. And I apologise if you heard a crinkling sound in the background then. My cat decided that he wanted to lay on the carrier bag that my microphone lives in, so thanks, dude. You've taken up to episode 20 to make an appearance. And now you are. Now here you are. So, let's get into episode 20. Have you ever used the saying sweet FA? Perhaps you were under the impression that FA stood for fuck all, because I was. Well, I can tell you that the saying originated as Sweet Fanny Adams, which, if you're unsure of what the saying even means, it just means nothing at all, really. Like, to say sweet FA is like, oh, I know sweet FA about blah 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 blah. That's what that means. So that's what you need to know about this case, the fact that Fanny Adams became synonymous with nothing at all, kind of a testament to her life and death in a way, but her case would become infamous, obviously. Like every good story, and how I personally like to do things, let's start at the beginning. I'm not one of these podcasters who can write a great, storytelling narrative and get you, hooked in with, all these different, oh my god, this person was found and then blah 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 blah. I like to start at the beginning. I'm a huge believer, especially when it comes to cases of serial killers, etc. Everything starts at the beginning, in childhood, the beginning of the story. That's where the important information is. So, without rambling anymore, let me tell you the story. So, Fanny Adams was born on April 30th in 1859 in Alton, Hampshire, which is in England. Adams lived with her dad, George, and her other siblings on Tanhouse Lane on the northern side of Alton, which is a small market town. Next door to Fanny was George and Anne Adams, who are believed to have been her biological parents on her father's side. According to an 1861 census of the market town, Fanny actually lived with her father, 5 other siblings, and the story does mention her mum, Harriet Adams, who was formerly Mills, but in the census information I can't see that she was present, but that could be an error perhaps, because she is mentioned quite heavily in the story. So anyway, there's her dad, George Adams, her mum, Harriet Adams, Fanny, and then 5 other siblings. So it's a busy household, okay? It's busy. Fanny was just 8 years old when her life was cruelly taken away from her, and locals of the village described her as, quote, tall, intelligent, with a lively and cheerful disposition, end quote. She often appeared older than her age of 8, both in character and appearance, and was often seen as the dutiful big sister to Elizabeth Ann, who was known as Lizzie, and Lily Ada Adams, which are her 2 younger sisters. So, she was very much the dutiful big sister, so it's really setting the scene for what Fanny was like. So, life in the 1860s wasn't too kind to anyone, as you can imagine, but through the eyes of a sweet and innocent 8-year-old, it didn't matter about hardships or other issues when you had a best friend. Minnie Warner was also 8 years old, and she lived next door but one, which I think is a very British way of saying she lived 2 doors down, but I'd say next door but one. 2 doors, whatever. So she lived next door but one from the Adams family, and because they were the same age, her and Fanny soon became best friends. Although life wasn't easy in the 1860s, the small market town of Alton never really saw much crime, and the main thoroughfare for the town was, of course, the markets and the local breweries. Around the Townhouse Lane area was a vast array of fields, meadows, some of which were used for the growing of hops, which is the main component in beer. The large green spaces left plenty of areas for local children to play in without getting, into much hassle or much trouble. The afternoon of August 24th, 1867 was a hot and sunny day, a perfect day for local children to play out in the local fields before it was time for tea and bed. Fanny, her younger sister Lizzie, and best friend Minnie Warner crept and asked Harriet Adams, which was Fanny and Lizzie's mum, if they could go out and play in the local meadows. Now, during the initial part of the episode, I said that I was unsure whether Harriet Adams was in fact in the household due to her not being mentioned in the census. However, from the development of the story, as you'll see, it seems like she was there. It could have been an error incorrectly reported. Maybe it's a possibly patriarchal thing, so that the man of the house and the children were declared, but the wife wasn't, maybe because perhaps it was just assumed that if there's a husband or a man living there would be a woman of the house. I'm not sure. I don't really have time to go into patriarchal reporting of censuses, but she was there, from what we know. So, for Harriet, this was a welcomed relief from having to supervise the children, and it meant that she could just get on with the rest of the housework before having to cook everyone's tea. It may seem irresponsible to us now in the 21st century, but you really do have to remember that 1867 was a very, very different time, and children were much, much more independent than they are today. Even 20, 30 years ago, kids were doing things that you would never dream about letting your kid do now. So to say that it was irresponsible to let her go and play in a field behind her house, maybe not, but no one is here to blame. Fanny's not here to, Fanny isn't to blame, her mum isn't to blame. There's only one person to blame, and that's the person who did this horrible crime. Delighted that they were free to go and play in the fields for hours on end, Fanny, Lizzie and Minnie made their way to the local flood meadows, which was situated at the northern end of Townhouse Lane. This was in perfect proximity, as it was far enough away that the children felt they could play in peace, all while not being too far from their parents' beckon and call. The three set off making their way to the flood meadows through a hop garden. When down their path, they met 24-year-old Frederick Baker, who was a solicitor's clerk in Alton. Baker was what you could call a sharp-dressed man, at the time in a frock coat, light trousers and classic tall hat, which is a code of formal dress. If you sort of Google 1860s fashion, you'll see this. It's pretty standard what he's wearing. It's kind of what you would imagine someone of this era to be wearing. So Baker was actually new to the area and wasn't a local. He moved there about 2 months before, which makes it June 1867. So it makes him not only familiar with the town, but also the townspeople. And in a very close-knit community, such as a small market town of Alton, that matters. It seems that on August 24th, Baker was not just walking through Alton with the purpose of a leisurely walk, but with cruel intentions. He gave Minnie and Lizzie 3 halfpence each, and Fanny 1 halfpenny, telling them that the money was for them to spend on sweets. Now, Baker was new to the town of Alton, but the 3 girls had actually seen Baker before. They actually saw him during church services. So in their young minds, it wasn't too suspicious or wrong to take money from him. Obviously, they've seen him before, and they've seen him in church, so that's sort of a bit of comfort to a kid, I guess. You've seen them in a familiar place and in a church, so Baker didn't simply carry on with his day after this encounter, as he probably should have. He watched Fanny, Minnie and Lizzie play in the fields and lanes, and even picked blackberries for them, which they ate without a moment's hesitation, which now you would be like, whoa, don't take money from strangers, and you definitely don't accept food that a stranger has given you, that, you open yourself up to so many possibilities. But these are children, they're 8, and some of them are even younger. It's 1867, I'm not going to victim blame here, whatevs. After about an hour or so of watching the girls frolic around, Baker asked Fanny if she would like to go with him to Shaldon, which was the next village over from Alton. Lizzie and Minnie had become tired at this point and just headed on home, leaving Fanny with Baker. Now, Fanny actually refused to leave with Baker, and this is when Baker scooped Fanny up into his arms and just carried her away. Just walked away with her in his arms as if it was super casual to be carrying an 8-year-old. Now, so much to their credit, Lizzie and Minnie ran straight to Minnie's house, where her mother, Martha Warner, was, and she was cleaning the house and preparing food. Now, sadly, Martha ignored the girls and simply brushed the story off as a tale of fantasy created by 2 young girls. Since they had been brushed off by the adult they told and therefore trusted, they just carried on playing as if nothing had happened that August afternoon. It wasn't until some hours later at 5 p.m. when residents of Tanhouse Lane noticed that Fanny was missing. It was then that Lizzie and Minnie told Harriet Adams, so Lizzie and Fanny's mum, what had happened to Fanny, and the trio set off in the search of the missing 8-year-old. On their search for the missing 8-year-old, they came across none other than Frederick Baker, who, according to the Hampshire Chronicle, told Mrs. Adams and another adult, Mrs. Gardner, that he often gave children money to buy sweets, and that Fanny was, bound to be somewhere close by. She'd probably just run off somewhere. Because Baker was a solicitor's clerk and held a high-up position within the local town's administration, Mrs. Gardner and Mrs. Adams were not immediately suspicious of Mr. Baker. Everyone was under the belief that Fanny had simply lost track of time. She was in a nearby field, maybe she'd wandered off too far, and that's why they couldn't find her. 2 hours later, at around 7 p.m, Fanny was still nowhere to be seen, and the Adams family were really beginning to worry. So much so that Harriet Adams, the matriarch of the family, rallied everyone on Tanhouse Lane to start the search for Fanny. Hours of searching led to nothing, and Fanny was nowhere to be seen. That was until Crimean War veteran Thomas Gates made the horrific discovery in a nearby hop garden. Fanny's head had been stuck on 2 poles, one of her ears had been cut off, and she had 2 large cuts, one from mouth to ear and one across the temple. I can imagine that for a war veteran the sight of disemboweled and mangled bodies was something that he had probably come accustomed to, but I don't think anything could have prepared Thomas Gates for the sight of a mutilated 8-year-old. Further investigation by the locals of Tanhouse Lane revealed the grisly scene that many in Alton would struggle to forget. Fanny's arms, head and legs had been cut away from her torso, there being 3 deep incisions on the side of her chest. On the left side of her chest. There was also a cut so deep on her arm that the muscles were visible and visibly divided. Her forearm had been severed at her elbow joint, and her left leg was almost completely severed from her hip joint. Her left foot had also been removed just above the ankle. The brutality didn't stop there, as her right leg looked like it had just been ripped from her torso, like a wild animal had gotten a hold of the sweet 8-year-old. The worst part? Everything from her pelvis and chest were gone. Her heart was gone, her liver had been slashed numerous times, and her vagina had been cut away from her body. Poor Fanny Adams's eyes had been cut from her face and were found near the River Wey. Now, understandably, Harriet Adams was beside herself at the sight of her sweet 8-year-old Fanny dismembered and strewn about like a wild animal had attacked her. She tried to run to George Adams to tell him what had happened, but grief-stricken Harriet collapsed before she was able to reach the cricket field that George was on. Word soon reached George by the grapevine, and completely enraged George Adams ran home, grabbed his shotgun, and promised to snuff out the animal that had done this to Fanny. Luckily, neighbours of Tanhouse Lane were able to console George Adams and convinced him to take the evening to calm down before embarking on his hunt for justice for Fanny. Over the course of the next week or so, Alton locals began scouring the area in an attempt to collect Fanny's remains, as well as any evidence that could have been left behind by her killer. Sadly, because this crime took place in 1867, no one was really paying too much attention to the crime scene, and obviously there wasn't a huge awareness around forensic science like there is now. So it's easy to assume that within the first hour of the crime being discovered, the whole crime scene would have been tampered with or destroyed due to, foot traffic, people walking through the area, and then recovering items at different points through the night, how they were stored. Obviously, 1867, no one has a forensic awareness. So, it is what it is, sadly. With the help of Alton locals, most of Fanny's remains were recovered on that night, despite the summer dusk rolling in. The only parts that were not found on the evening of August 24th, 1867, was an arm, a foot, and her intestines. All of Fanny's remains were taken back to a local's house to be sewn together, to give her some semblance of dignity in death, and also so that her parents didn't have to see her in a dismembered state. One of the most horrific pieces of evidence recovered was a stone with pieces of Fanny's flesh and hair still stuck to it. Police believe that the recovered stone was, in fact, the murder weapon. So, the police then began their hunt for the killer, and according to the testimony of Minnie and Lizzie, they were able to deduce that Frederick Baker had been the last person seen with Fanny before she died. So, they made their way through the market town of Alton to the office where Baker worked at around 9 p.m. This was odd, as Baker was only supposed to be at work until 8 p.m. that evening. Despite many protests of innocence, of course, Baker was taken in by police. Upon physical inspection, Baker was found to be carrying 2 small knives, much like those that could have been responsible for the mutilation carried out on Fanny's body. Now, these knives were not found with any blood on them, but it's really not to say that Baker couldn't have quickly wiped them down after the crime. Interestingly, Baker had small spots of blood on his shirt, and he had recently attempted to wash his trousers to remove blood staining. When asked to explain the blood, Baker simply said, quote, "Well, I don't see a scratch or cut on my hands to account for the blood," end quote. One of the strongest pieces of evidence in the eyes of the police was Baker's personal diary that was found in his desk drawer amongst his other legal papers. The entry for Saturday, August 24th, 1867 read, quote, "Killed a young girl. It was fine and hot," end quote. Now, for someone who was being accused of the murder and disturbing mutilation of an 8-year-old, Frederick Baker was apparently extremely calm and collected when he was speaking to police, which I found strange. He never tried to insist that he was insane or scramble for any other explanation for the crime. He seemed very well put together and coherent. I guess maybe that's because he has experience as working as a solicitor. I don't know. I just find it strange how you could be so calm whilst being accused of something so horrific. But that's just me. The investigation was long and arduous, with police examining every shred of evidence and every eyewitness testimony to ensure that they had the strongest case possible. A young boy who lived near the Adams home became a star witness for the police. The boy claimed that he had seen Baker around 2 p.m. on Saturday, 24th of August 1867, and that he was completely covered in blood. He also saw him washing his hands and clothes on a riverbank, and also cleaned a small knife and some other weapons, which he then put back into his jacket. All of Baker's clothes and 2 knives were seized as evidence and taken to Professor A.S. Taylor at Guy's Hospital in London, where a full forensic exam was conducted. Now, it was found to be human blood present on Baker's knives. However, Professor Taylor did state that he would have expected to see more blood and rust on them, considering the fact that of what they had been involved in. The medical examiner concluded that there were no signs of sexual assault, and Fanny's cause of death was most likely a blow to the head with a large object like a rock. Disturbingly of all, the dismemberment of Fanny only took an hour and took place when she was recently deceased and still warm. The 2 smaller knives found with Baker were determined of not being capable of dismembering Fanny, meaning that another knife would have been needed, but this has never been recovered. Due to weird British law, which we have a lot of them, in 1867, a case of sudden death has to have an inquest held by the coroner, not by a judicial court. Strange. So, on August 27th, 1867, Deputy Coroner Robert Hartfield began proceedings of the inquest into the sudden death of Fanny Adams. First up to give evidence was 8-year-old Minnie Warner, who was Fanny's best friend and present on the day that she was murdered. Minnie testified that Baker gave her money for sweets and also gave money to Fanny. She wasn't able to pick him out and identify him, but she was able to describe what he was wearing that day. As we know, eyewitness testimonies are unreliable at best, never mind from an 8-year-old whose best friend has just been murdered in an extremely brutal fashion. Next to give evidence was Harriet Adams, Fanny's mother. She identified Baker as the man that was seen near the hop garden where Fanny would ultimately be found. Harriet had apparently asked Baker his name, to which he refused, but he did tell her that he worked at the solicitor's office, which is weird. Why would you not tell someone your name, but you tell them where you work? Strange. When it came to Baker's questioning, his defence team argued that he was not guilty by reason of insanity, a plea that is often used in criminal cases despite only making up a very small proportion of them. They argued that Baker's dad had been violent to him throughout childhood, that his cousins had been in and out of various asylums, and his sister had died from a brain fever, which I googled and it says where the part of the brain becomes inflamed. I'm guessing through infection. I'm not sure how that's linked to mental illness, but okay, go off. And they also said that Baker had attempted suicide once before. Sadly for Baker, it took the jury just 15 minutes to deliver their verdict, and that verdict was, drumroll please, guilty. Despite pleas from the defence, Baker was found to be guilty of the murder and mutilation of sweet Fanny Adams, and his execution date was set for Christmas Eve of 1867. That's a cruel date to execute someone. Christmas Eve 1867 came and Baker was hanged at the Winchester Gaol with over 5,000 people in attendance, making it a huge public spectacle in the small market town of Alton. Baker had written a letter to the family of Fanny asking them for forgiveness for what he had done, quote, in an unguarded hour, end quote. Fanny Adams was buried in Alton Cemetery. Her headstone reads, "Sacred to the memory of Fanny Adams, aged 8 years and 4 months, who was cruelly murdered on Saturday, August 24th, 1867. Fear not them which kill the body, but are not able to kill the soul. Rather fear him which is able to destroy both body and soul in hell." Matthew 10, verse 28. So that was episode 20, the murder of Fanny Adams. What I did forget to mention in my intro is that this case was suggested to me by Anna. I don't want to say your last name, so I'll just say Anna for, sake of privacy. So thank you for sending me that email with all of those cases. I am slowly working my way through them, but this one jumped out at me because I recognised the name. So this one's for you, Anna. Thank you. As always, you can support the podcast on Patreon. You'll get exclusive content and early access from just $1 a month. So just go on Patreon, search for the True Crime Witch Podcast. I'm on Facebook, just the True Crime Witch Podcast. I'm on Twitter, just at True Crime Witch. Instagram, just at True Crime Witch Podcast. Probably on some other social media, but I don't massively use it. You can send me an email just at truecrimewitch@outlook.com if you'd like to request any cases, or you just want to say hi and want to have a message read out. I'll do that. Please don't forget to leave me a rating and review on iTunes, and if you leave me a 5-star review with your name and where you're from, the start of next episode, I will give you a little shout out and a little thank you. So, that was episode 20. I'm sorry this episode's been late. I've been ill and dealing with some other stuff, but finally out, so apologies. Anyway, remember friends, stay safe and stay spooky.